Those of you who attended one or two of the first lectures know that this is sort of the run-up to the minor studies, which will start in September, and which you're all students among you are invited to attend. For this third lecture, we're very happy to have with us Professor Fernando Enns, who is Professor of Theology and Ethics, and the Director of the Amsterdam Center for Religion and Peace and Justice Studies. And he will take us through the evolution of just war and just peace. After his lecture, there will be all time available for you to ask questions. The session will be conducted in English in total, but if you have problem posing a question in English, please do so in Dutch, and we'll translate it for you. Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for coming. It's good to see such a big crowd at this wonderful afternoon. Maybe you had some other ideas with this fine weather to spend in the sun, but we want to focus on topics that are difficult to wrestle with, as you will see in a minute. I have to excuse a bit my voice. I'm still struggling with a cold, so I hope my voice will carry us through this lecture. If you have problems understanding it, just raise your hand, and then I will either slow down or give my paper to my colleague, and then he can have the lecture. That's also fine. We can share the burden. Well, it's not a burden. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really happy with this new program and this new initiative of the Vrije Universiteit, and I look forward to fulfill all the plans that we have made. Now, this is, as was announced, one of the introductory lectures into this bachelor minor that we have designed for the coming academic year. So it's a bit of an overview. I will not go too much into details. Maybe we have enough time then in the second half of the time we have together here, that we can raise questions and go a bit deeper into some details that you are more interested in. So just to alert you to the fact that this is more like an overview lecture. New wars, terrorism, and peace building in the 21st century, and it's of course the just war theory. For whom is this a new terminology? Just war theory. For who has never heard about this? Ah, very good. So the rest can leave now. So you can and you stay, then we study together. Today, peace ethics faces new challenges. Every regional conflict creates specific effects on a globalized world, as well as every step of the international community affects the different regions in various ways. All of that is transmitted by the so-called social media in real time, so that we all constantly witness some new violent outbreaks in yet some other part of the globe. And I have some examples. It's not so difficult to think of examples. Sorry to say that. You can think of the war that is going on in Syria and the constant flow of media coverage. You can think of the demonstrations that we just saw at the Gaza Strip at the border, and the shooting, the massive shooting, mass killing, some people even call it, by the Israeli military forces. Think of the ongoing bombings, killings in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and so on. Military actions of nation states confront individual actors of terror. Since some years, this has been called war on terror, following the labeling of the Bush administration in the US after those terrible attacks at 9/11 in the year 2001. After 10 years of great hope for a better world without war, since the end of the so-called Cold War between the East and the West, which in fact had been a hot war in so many places of the world, the military interventions of the Alliance of the Willing to Iraq and Afghanistan were initiated and destroyed much more than the hope for a more peaceful world. It destroyed the willingness and the trust in a new world order that would not accept military solutions any longer to any conflict. It destroyed the growing opinion that there is no such thing like a just or a justifiable war, especially in times of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. The wars in former Yugoslavia had already shown that politicians and the connected societies of the Western military alliance, NATO, were hesitant to believe in that new world order anyway. And when the genocide in Rwanda occurred, the vast majority of populations in the democratic Western states who claim the heritage of the Judeo-Christian tradition was fast in giving in to the so-called political realities that cannot be changed or solved in non-violent ways. And quickly, the just war doctrine was revitalized also by political scientists, by scholars of all disciplines, even by ethicists who develop their thinking on the basis of Christian faith. Let's be clear, in the end, the main reasons for all of those new conflicts remain the same, as it has always been. It is about power and the assurance of natural resources. As simple as that. Clearly, fundamentalist dressings come in many forms: religious, ethnic, ideological, or political fundamentalisms. In the latest days, even the nationalist fashion is revitalized again. These fundamentalistic and/or populistic powers lead large communities into violent conflicts with those who had been friendly neighbors for long periods of time. Now you can think about northern Nigeria. This is a picture of the Boko Haram forces, where Christians and Muslims had lived peacefully together for many generations. And now, under the attacks of Boko Haram, the hostility between Muslims and Christians leads to violent separations in many villages and cities. It is not too well known that Boko Haram, this Muslim fundamentalistic group, has killed more Muslims than it has killed Christians. Most of the time it is reported as, yeah, these are Muslims and they kill the Christians. But the fact is that these groups kill also Muslims, and they have killed more Muslims than they have killed Christians. I had the chance to visit Nigeria last year for a visit in order to study the conflict, and it is actually very sad to see how much people, families even that are containing of Muslims and Christians within one family, that they are now even separated because of the ongoing violence. Today we call these new wars. Sometimes it is called asymmetric conflict, because you have a military force over against a terroristic group, or you call it hybrid warfare. Think of the Russian government, the Russian military forces who took over Crimea and so on, in which whole nation states are collapsing, failing states. So these are all new terminologies that we use in order to describe these new conflicts. New wars, asymmetric conflicts, hybrid warfare, and failing states. Failing states, then you can think of countries like Somalia, you can think of Yemen and other states. So the promise of a more peaceful world after the end of the East-West confrontations during the 20th century has been pulverized by the readiness to use military violence again by political actors on all sides. And we are told that all of these are totally new situations, which require the massive comeback of military forces, military budgets, and the rise of weapons productions, especially in Europe. So the European countries, you follow the news, I believe, when you're sitting here. You're interested in these topics, how the European governments are now, rising up their budgets, military budgets, because of all these conflicts that are going on. Still, if all these challenges are described as totally new, isn't it quite staggering how much the discussions on peace ethics, and even more so the discussions on peace politics, remain in the well-known traditional polarities? So you have new situations, and they are described as totally new situations, but the answers are the old ones. The sheer helplessness is revealed in the repetition of a reasoning that does not seem to be able, or that does not seem to be willing, to develop really new methodologies and strategies. And this, of course, is a challenge to scholars and research institutions of different disciplines who are concerned with peace and conflict studies in general and with peace ethics in particular. In light of the many crises, the call for responsible political action is heard all over, and rightly so. But if responsible political action is simply equated with the readiness to send troops or air fighters or missiles or killer drones, it seems that it is simply giving in to the short-sighted longing for one's own security instead of searching for a sustainable, long-term solution that could create safety for all involved. So most of the time, if you follow the political discussions, it's very much on security, and it is our security. Not so often we see that a debate that is concerned about how can we discuss this situation in terms of what would be security for all parties involved. That would lead into another discussion. Should it not be irritating that it is exactly in those contexts in which the international community or some nation powers have decided to intervene with military forces that seem to produce one terrorist network after the other? And when I use terrorist, I always think of brackets, because this labeling of terrorism is, of course, also a topic in itself. Now think of Iraq, think of Afghanistan, think of Libya, think of Gaza, think of Somalia, then of course Syria, Yemen, Mali, and the whole Great Lakes regions in Africa altogether. And this list is far from being complete. So these are all places where the international community or alliances of the willing, so-called, have decided to intervene with military forces. And it's exactly these locations, these contexts, where new terrorist groups seem to emerge. And you question, then of course the question is, well, is there a relation between these dynamics? And yet the Western democracies continue to export weapons in ever-growing numbers to the governments in those regions, hoping that stability, another political term that is used very often, stability will grow from them, while it is obvious that these governments will hardly remain in power due to corruption and the unjust treatment of their own populations, or at least towards parts of their populations. This shows you, just to give you the rough numbers, SIPRI is a Swedish peace institute, very well known, very well renowned. They offer new statistics every year, the latest, and that is very helpful, because you can see, of course, then how the export of weapons, where most weapons come from. Most of you know that, but if you go through the list, United States, if you just take the NATO or Western European countries, then it is striking to see that we are part of those who export the most weapons. So that is also needs to be taken into account when we analyze conflict and peace building. The investment in military education in these countries is also growing. Like in Afghanistan, for example, at least I'm more familiar with the German context, so the German government and the German military is investing huge amounts of money and personnel in training police and military forces in these countries, in Iraq, in Mali, and so on. As if we really believe that this could be a way to bring some control on the ongoing violent spirals. I believe that the quest for responsible political action needs to be raised anew, based on moral and ethical reflection, and that this quest needs to find some new answers in light of these devastating situations, if it really aims at a more peaceful world, if it really means to protect those who are in danger, if it really searches for security for all and stability for all. Now let me be clear, I share all the sympathetic emotions, sometimes spontaneous reflexes that you probably also share, when we see the images of humans, men, women, children, under immediate oppression and confronted with murder, kidnapping, or rape. As we saw in northern Iraq some years ago, the United Nations reported that at least 40,000 members of the Yazidi sect, many of them women and children, took refuge in Mount Sinjar, in local legends identified as the final resting place of Noah's Ark. Facing slaughter at the hands of jihadists, surrounding them below if they fled. Here's another chair. We welcome the latecomers as well. So they fled, and you probably recall this story of the Yazidi who fled to this mountain, facing slaughter at the hands of jihadists surrounding them below if they fled, or death by dehydration if they stayed. So really a devastating situation where you say, like, so what don't we have to do something? In Germany, even bishops of the Christian churches were calling for weapons to be sent to these people in order to defend themselves. The least one could do, it was said, we simply cannot stare and do nothing. Now this is a very important sentence. We simply cannot stare and do nothing. That was the common voice. So when you're asked, are you in favor of sending weapons or are you against? Usually the reaction, what you get is, you cannot simply stare and do nothing. Keep that in mind. And I truly agree with this statement. From the perspective of a Christian ethical perspective, we simply cannot stare and do nothing. So that is clear. You can become guilty for doing nothing. That is a simple but so true insight that we share. You can become guilty when you do certain acts, but sometimes it's also like doing nothing is becoming guilty. But I truly disagree if this argumentation suffices to legitimize to fall back into the old patterns of behavior. If this suffices to seek refuge in that old logic of the ultima ratio reasoning of the just war doctrine in favor of military intervention. So it almost seems like, it's like you only have these two options. It's either doing nothing or doing military intervention. And that I think is too simple. But that in fact is exactly what we see happening all the time in all the argumentations. It's always going into these two alternatives. And it is sometimes even nowadays it's really strange to observe that a lot of politicians in the Western democracies in our countries are very fast in legitimizing military intervention, military action, and you can call that war if you want, because it is enough to say, well, we cannot just simply stare and do nothing. So is that enough? Do we only have these two alternatives? That is the question that we wrestle with, or is there more? Now, so this what I criticize or what I observe and criticize is that people fall back into the just war criteria. Now, the just war, for those for whom this is new, the others can sleep for 2 minutes. These are the criteria just for theory. Augustine, one of the church fathers, the most famous church fathers, was really the one who started to think about this. When Christianity, you have to keep in mind, this is a very old doctrine, but it's still used even by people who are not Christians, so you don't have to be a Christian to buy into this logic, and it is used usually in secular terms now. Augustine was the one who started to think about, this Christianity. The early Christians were, of course, not in power. They were suppressed. They were oppressed. They were not allowed. So there was not even a chance to become involved in military action. Now that changes totally under Constantine. All of a sudden, Christianity becomes the religion of the empire. Now that posed a lot of questions, of course, to the theologians of those days, because all of a sudden it does a lot to a religion and to theology if you are in an oppressed minority or if you are in power. So if you sit on the lap of the emperor as a theologian, you might think in different ways over against being in jail or being tortured. We see that up until this day. Totally different theologies come out of that. And that has nothing to do with Christianity. That is, we see the same in Islam, we see the same in Judaism, and so on. Now, these are the criteria. They have been developed over the centuries. Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, the most famous Roman Catholic theologian and most influential, developed these further. So it was not from the beginning as constructed like this, but the beginning is with Augustine, continues with Thomas Aquinas, and is developed further. So we have jus ad bellum. So when the question is when is war? When is going to war legitimized? How can we legitimize that? Now this is a university, so we can use a bit of Latin. I think that's just fair. But I'll give you also the English terms for those who have not studied Latin yet. Legitima potestas. So there needs to be a legitimate authority. That's criterion number one. If there's no legitimate authority, you cannot wage war. There has to be a justified reason. Now, what would be a good reason to wage war? Oppression. Ultima ratio, last resort. What does that mean?
No other means and no other means.
We have tried everything else. Go ahead.
Sorry, I have a question. With legitimate authority, is that the person declaring war, or that you have to declare war on a legitimate?
No, the person, the authority who is deciding. So think of the Dutch government. The Dutch government can declare war against another country, or against terrorists or whatever, if it is a legitimized authority. Now, it is legitimized because there were elections. This is a democratic system, so it is a legitimate authority. It would be totally different if you would have some, a student of the VU would now declare war against someone. We say like, yeah, sorry, guy, but you're not a legitimate authority. You cannot. We will not follow you, and you don't have that authority. Yeah.
So then Al-Qaeda could not be one of those because it's not a legitimate authority.
Yeah.
So if they declare war, then
Yeah. Now, what is the problem?
they are not a legitimate authority. They're terrorist group.
Now, why are you saying they're not legitimate authority? Very good question. So we shall not fool ourselves with these beautiful criteria. It's in theory it looks very, very, very great, and it is great. I mean, there's centuries of thinking behind this. So it's not. I don't want to play this down, but at the same time we have to look at it very critically and say, well, okay, what if we say legitimate authority? That sounds very nice. Okay, let's go on. Al-Qaeda is of course not legitimate. Well, your question is totally right. Well, who says that? If there are some followers who say it is legitimate because we are oppressed, because of all kinds of reasons, well, who is then going to decide if it is legitimate or not? Well, today we have the United Nations, so we have we have international law, we have some kind of tools to value that, but it remains difficult, and that is we can take that as an example. That remains difficult with all the criteria. If you really sit down and start to think about it, let's take ultima ratio, last resort. That's also a very famous one. Maybe one of the most famous ones. We've tried everything else. There's nothing else we can do. Well, think for a minute. When can you say that? When do we really have a situation where this is ultima ratio, where you say like this is there's no other way anymore?
Life and death, confrontation, direct confrontation. It's either you or the other one.
And when is that? Give us an example.
I guess on the national level when foreign authority wants to start a debate.
So North Korea, let's say.
For example, why not? If they're in front of the borders of Europe or Holland,
Well, they are in front of.
might be the last resort.
Yeah. We have to speak a bit louder. Thank you. So that everybody can hear that. So we can think of examples, and it's always good when you have a theory that's brilliant. It makes a lot of sense, but you always have to put it into practice and test it with a praxis. Is that really helping? Recta intentio, a justified motivation. So what would that be? Think. What would be a good motivation to start a war? Protection, for example. That would be, I think, would be good. Yeah.
How is it different from justified reason?
A justified reason is more that it's also looking at the goals. So if we have the reason, for example, is that we want to make peace, and therefore we have to wage war. Motivation is more like this protection, but it is a bit vague. We would have to. Yeah, but that would be like the immediate intention. The immediate intention and motivation would we have to protect these people, but the reason why we do it would be because there should be peace also for these people. But you see the interlinkage also of these criteria, and you're right in pointing out that maybe that is not 100% clear. Now then we have the use in bello. So the criteria that help us to wage war in a justifiable way. Proportionate means, what is that? That's self-evident. What does that mean? Proportionate means.
I think that the way you make war is in relation to what you want to achieve.
Yeah. So, for example, can I use chemical weapons? Never. Okay.
But that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, that's what we were referring earlier to. It depends on which side you are. Is it ever a proportionate mean if you're on the other side? If you're the one who's being bombed or gassed?
Yeah, very good observation. Did you hear that? Say it again. You have to speak up. Sorry.
Is it ever, I mean, what you referred to earlier on about the paradoxes in these criteria and the reality of it, or how it plays out in reality, what is a proportionate mean? Is it ever proportionate if you're on the other side, being bombed or being gassed?
Yeah. So it's the question of perspective, right? It's I mean, am I the one who is applying the violence and the war, or am I on the side of the victims? That I say, well, here comes a plane and is throwing a bomb. Well, can that ever be proportionate? That's a very good question. So and that interestingly enough, that question has not been discussed through the centuries. You know, which perspective do we really look at when we look at this theory? It was always assumed that we are the ones who are asking ourselves, can we wage war? And when is war justifiable? But that assumes also that I have the means. I have the weapons, I have the military, I have everything in my hand, and I'm under control, and I can decide if I want to wage war against somebody else.
Israel, Gaza, a case in point.
Mm-hmm.
Bullets versus stones.
Yeah, is that proportionate?
Seems to be disproportionate.
Why? I mean, the Israeli government has told us, and they have explained that to the media, that these are terrorists who try to invade Israeli territory. So we have to stop them.
Yeah. With any means? Only proportionate means.
Yeah, well, they didn't use chemical weapons. They didn't use a nuclear weapon. They simply use bullets.
But they bombed with lots of collateral damage, isn't it? Yeah.
Even if they're terrorists, as they say, they're still unarmed. So, and they're protesting, and I mean,
Yeah.
it's just not justified, like, regarding this theory.
Right. So then we would say, so according to these voices, you would say that is unproportionate, and therefore you cannot use. I mean, on the basis of this theory, you could say, well, we have a very good set of criteria. This is unproportionate. You know, you're just shooting these people, and they are just throwing stones. So that is improportionate. Okay, differentiation between combatants and non-combatants, very important. But again, when you look at the new situations that we have that I was describing earlier, the new situations that we are facing, you know, war against terror, that labeling, it becomes more and more blurred what is a combatant? That is another difficulty with the theory. Prohibition, but it is, of course, I mean, it was for all good reasons. I mean, it is the people who invented and were thinking this theory. They were really clever, and it was the intention was not to make it easy to wage war. It was the opposite. The intention has always been to say, like, war is really taking other people's lives, and we have to be really sure on ethical grounds, when is this ever justifiable? So we have to really think hard about this. And so in order to make war more complicated and stop people from waging war, these criteria have been developed. So a differentiation between combatants and non-combatants has been really important. You cannot just kill civilians. That is no-go. I mean, that is not a just war. You can only kill other military forces. But this also, go ahead. How about child soldiers? Well, they're combatants. So you could suggest to develop this theory further, say like, well, this differentiation is not detailed enough. We should go further and say, well, only those under 18. So only those above 18, sorry.
Is this idea also not pre-total mobilization, pre-First World War and Second World War? What we see in the First World War is that the English feel that they have to start out Germany to end the war, which is clearly also aiming at non-combatants. But because non-combatants are such part of the system of war and warfare, I think they make the argument that it is aiming at combatants.
Yeah. The problem is that there was a time, of course, when war in Europe, at least, was really very well organized. It's hard to believe that, but it was. You know, you have an army on this hill, and you have an army on that hill, and then you have the generals, and you say, like, you know, the horses should go this way, and the troops should go that way. You meet somewhere in the fields, and then in the evening you go back to your home and have a nice dinner with your wife. That, of course, I mean, that's of course not true, but it was a different kind of war. Whereas we have now situations that are totally different, and only looking at First World War and Second World War, where you can debate. You know, was that a just war that the Allied troops were fighting against Germany, for example? Was that not justifiable? Looking at all the difficulties that and the horror that Germany was spreading out in Europe. Wasn't it justifiable that the Allies would enter? Well, you can question that, and you can use, and this of course has always been used, this theory, to legitimize it. But what about this differentiation, combatants and non-combatants? It was a massive killing, of course, of non-combatants all the time. Prohibition of mala in se, so means that are never justifiable. That would be this. This is a new one. Augustine had no clue about atomic warfare, but when atomic weapons came into being, there was, of course, this was included there. Say like there are certain means that you can never justify. And Hiroshima is something that we can never justify.
Child soldier is a non-combatant, therefore we are not allowed to defend ourselves against a child soldier. Is that what I understood from?
What do you propose? What is your proposal?
Well, answering a question is a question. Okay, but.
Well, no, you know, I'm putting the question back to you because there is no clear answer.
Well, I would say if I want to go back to the logic, of course, if someone is attacking me with a weapon, and then like my life or my comrade's life or someone's life is in danger, therefore my attack should be, of course, proportionate in this case, but self-defense is totally legitimate. So that's my legal answer, I would say. But what is your answer?
This lecture is not about me, but we can come to that. The only thing that I would like to say at this point is, what do you mean when you say self-defense?
Well, we are speaking about child. Well, the name of soldier, of course, there is some definitions that means that that person is carrying an arm, and that person is willing to attack a specific target. So let's say if that target is me or my comrade or my hope or whatever, life.
Yes.
So that's right.
Or your territory. Okay. That's your life in your territory and other lives that needs to be debated.
In some sense, I can say that like even my territory is a place that I can consider it as a part of my honor, and therefore, if I
Honor.
yes, because like, for example, some countries, even in the case of Israel, you can see that because if they are attacking Israel, then they say like they are trespassing my territory.
Yeah.
Therefore, it's my
Well, you're now taking us back to this. So you would say a just cause or a justified reason would be honor. Well, that could be discussed, I'm sure. But I keep that in mind. Thank you for your comments. The question of self-defense is just to respond to that quickly. Of course, there's always the right to self-defense, and it would be stupid not to defend yourself. I mean, as simple as that. The question remains how. So it is not the question. The tricky question in this whole subject is not can I defend myself or not. Well, that's a self-given. Of course, you should defend yourself, and of course, you should defend your family, and you should defend your territory and so forth. The interesting question is how, and which means, and what can be used, and how far can you go, and so forth. That's the interesting question. Okay, let's move on. And then, of course, after the war, reconstitution of a just order and peace building. You hear that also all the time. This is also something that has been added to this theory in the latest time. That there is also a responsibility to, of course, reconstitute a just order. I mean, it's not enough when you start a war and you go to another place and you wage war somewhere. It also includes the responsibility to rebuild that order there. So it's not enough just to move in, kill people, and move out. That's what this theory says. Okay, that's just war theory. Since we have questioned, and a lot of us have questioned that old doctrine of just war, and it was especially questioned during the Cold War, as I said earlier, when it was really two atomic empires facing each other, then this was the time when the just war theory was highly debated. Now that we have moved into more like, yeah, we can wage war again, it's possible, and there are so many different areas. The just war theory is back in the political discourse and also in the scientific discourse. Since we have questioned that old doctrine of just war, due to the existence of weapons of mass destruction, and since we have deconstructed this doctrine in the international community, and in some regards, and on ethical grounds, people hesitate to speak of just wars any longer. Some people. But what they do, and not only some Christian leaders, but also Western political leaders, is actually inconsistent, I believe. Whereas in that old doctrine of just war, we saw a whole number of criteria to be met. And we have seen all the criteria here. And it was only when all these criteria were met that one could claim to justify a war. So the idea of this theory was really that every criteria has to be met. You cannot just pick one and say, oh, that criteria is met, let's wage war. No, everything has to be met. Today, it seems to be sufficient to argue there is no alternative. It is the last resort, so let's do it. When we can analyze political leaders nowadays when it comes to waging war or sending military troops or waging war against terror, then they don't come up with a whole set of these criteria. Sometimes, most of the times, it's just enough to say, well, it's last resort. Nobody loves killing, nobody loves to send troops, but there's nothing else we can do. And we cannot stare and do nothing. Going back to that alternative. And by doing so, the inhibition threshold to war is lowered instead of rising it. So I'm arguing that by this behavior, by simplifying the reasons to wage war, this is really it is a misuse of this theory because it has lowered the thresholds to actually go to war. And some two additional questions come here that are just side remarks. Why doesn't this reflex of we simply cannot stare and do nothing? Why does this reflex doesn't occur when people are killed by starving from hunger? You could ask that question, like in Congo these days, or like in so many refugee camps in Syria and refugees in Lebanon or Jordan. When we see people starving from hunger, it's interesting that our governments and our societies do not have the same reflex, like we cannot stare and do nothing. We have to immediately, we have to respond. And that's not self-defense then, but it would be defense of these lives. Why is that impulse not with the same strength? Because sometimes, like, think of the Yazidi who were sitting on this mountain and really being attacked. Then everybody says, send them weapons. Well, if people are starving from hunger, and they are killed by hunger, by economic injustice, and we don't have the same reaction.
War is an industry in itself, isn't it?
War is an industry.
It benefits those who produce weapons if you wage war.
Mm-hmm.
While giving food.
But do you hear these arguments when we have political debates about war and peace?
But it's probably on the back of their minds.
Aha.
Now it's interesting.
Yeah.
Is in this case, it's not a matter of intention. The earth is not starving people because it hates people, while people are killing people because of reasons.
So you're saying that if people die from hunger, that is not killing.
In many cases, you can do something about it, and hunger is like the next step from like some other disorder. So in that sense, you could say, well, the intention should be to prevent hunger, or to not like protect your own interests, to like prevent hunger again.
Yeah, but I was more speaking about the ethical debate, that intention is an important part of ethical choice.
Mm-hmm.
Because the earth is not choosing to do anything, while people are choosing to kill. It's different between allowing somebody to die and killing somebody.
For example, in Sudan, what's happening now is that Saudi Arabia is buying a lot of ground from the government. So the government's saying that, but then at the same time, people are like being, well, to say nicely, removed from their own territory, land, ground. So they arrive in an area with no ground, they can't produce anything, and then they start to starve from hunger. But then you have an intention, and that's not maybe to kill them, but it is to take their fruitful lands.
Mm-hmm. It's simply a bit more complicated because we don't see the immediate actor. So the killer, so to speak, is somehow invisible. But if you analyze it, like in this case Sudan, and we have other places, of course, then we can see, well, this is human-made. It is not that the earth is killing its people. No, it is a human-made injustice that leads to the killing of people.
For example, for malaria, we get medicines for malaria in the countries where actually, well, mosquito is one of the biggest killers in the world, but we just simply don't provide the medicine. Is that killing as well, or is that nature? We should just do the nature argument.
Yeah. So for me, it's just this. As I said, it's a side remark to ask ourselves, why don't we have the same political reflexes that we have when we see massive killing somewhere, and when we think like we cannot just stare and do nothing. We have to do something. And the second side remark is what to do with the fact that those weapons made, for example, in Germany, which were sent to the Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, are now found in the hands of another Kurdish fraction called PKK, officially denounced as a terrorist group by the German government, or to be found in the black market in Syria. So the problem that we have by sending weapons, and we say like, okay, Germany is usually very hesitant, as you know, to send troops, so that German government shies away from that, because people think we have learned something. But sending weapons is, at least you can do that. Well, in this case, these weapons were sent were sent to northern Iraq, and now you have them all over at the black market in Syria. Now you have to. That again brings back the question of how consistent is this political way of acting. It seems that in fact we are witnessing more of a setback in the ethical and political reasoning instead of a progress in peace ethics. Now, in my judgment, it is not at all desirable to seek refuge in that old doctrine of just war in order to escape the political lack of willingness to identify alternatives. My plea is for the opposite, to develop further that new paradigm of just peace, which has been developed over the past 15 years within some academic think tanks and which has been adopted by the World Council of Churches. Consistent theological, ethical reasoning has been provided, but we need to develop related political action in order to convince societies and political leaders, at least those who claim to be driven by such a search for a just peace. A more detailed analysis of today's conflicts reveals, in very general terms again, unjust living conditions as the core origin of and motivation to violent actions. So if you really study conflicts, in most of the times, I've mentioned Nigeria, for example, northern Nigeria, where you have Boko Haram. You say, wow, these Islamist terrorists, you know, and it's cruel. I mean, there's nothing good about that. When you go there, you analyze the conflict, what you learn is really that there's huge corruption, the government is not functioning in these areas, the youth, the younger generation has no future whatsoever. Poverty is at a degree where you say like, okay, these kids have no other, there is no future. There's nothing that they can do. So in many conflicts, I don't want to oversimplify it, but I want to say that in most conflicts that you see, it is not Islam, it is not ideology, it is not religion, it is not you name it. It is usually the economic situation that leads to this kind of violence and getting involved, and that's coming again and again. The ever-growing streams of refugees, of which only a small portion makes it to the shores of the European Union, is a brutal illustration of that simple fact. Therefore, the paradigm of peace with justice, a just peace as we call it, has been established. And international organizations like the World Council of Churches, often together with the United Nations, have committed themselves to an ongoing search for alternative political action. A contemporary peace ethics needs then to be interreligious and intercultural in nature, because the intercontextual effects, as well as the interconfessional and interreligious resources, need to be taken into consideration. So I believe, or we believe, with this just peace concept, that it has to be interreligious, it has to be intercultural. It cannot be a concept that is just developed by some Western white thinkers in the universities or in some think tanks. It needs to be in constant dialogue with people from different perspectives, so that we include these different perspectives that we were talking about earlier.
Would you say an arms trader perspective would be interesting for that?
Pardon me?
Would you say an arms trader perspective would be interesting for that?
Say more.
So let's say an arms trader has something to say about that. Would that be interesting to consider?
What would he say, for example?
How certain international regulations would work regarding arms trading, or actually not work?
Sure. I would involve as many people as possible and as many perspectives as possible, because as soon as you exclude perspectives, you run the risk, of course, that they will not work with you in these efforts. So welcome, but you know, if you only come to the table to see how you can maximize your profit with your weapons, it might not be so interesting for you, because we try to do the opposite. So it's your choice as a weapons trader if you join us, and it shows something about yourself if you are joining this table or not. International regulations, yes, and that should be interesting for a weapons trader, I think. But then, of course, the question comes to how do you say that? Durchsetzbarkeit. How to enforce really international law, and how to make sure about that. Now that should be quite interesting. But as long as our governments are not really paying too much attention where the weapons are going, and I can speak for the German government. I mean, we have all kinds of regulations, and we are always told that we have probably the highest and most specific regulations of arms trade in the whole world. And yet you find, you know, our wonderful machine guns in some Mexican gang fighting where they should never end up, because our regulations say that you cannot sell a weapon to a Mexican gang because they might kill someone. It's only for the police forces, because Mexico is a friend of ours, and so we help the police forces who are there for law and order. But the regulation that we follow is, in fact, only going through that. We have a signature from that ministry in Mexico that tells us, yes, we have received 145 of these weapons, so we are fine. But what happens after that, not our business anymore. This is how it works.
Bigger issue that countries, governments, and even like government-owned companies like the big banks in Holland, for example, they invest so much in arms trade.
Yeah.
And you can say, well, we should have policies, but if the government like sees the economical picture as more important than well what happens across the border, we have a fundamental issue. I'm really skeptical about how this evolves.
Right.
What you could do is include in that proposition you have for a new paradigm, include economic motives.
Yeah, and I think it has to be economically sound also. But what is economically sound? That means you really include the international community, and not just what is economically sound for the Netherlands or Germany or France and so forth.
And which can be confronted.
Yeah.
Must we in this debate not also make a difference between easily accessible weapons and not easily accessible weapons? Like jet fighters need specialized personnel. It does show up as selling of weapons.
Right.
It's not going, well, when government sanctions, it's going to kill people. It's not going to be used in street fight.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, this is, as I said it earlier, this is more like an overview. What we see in this discussion is that we could go now into all these detailed questions, and we should do that, but we don't. We only have limited time, so we cannot do that. But it's important for us to see that these are the different dimensions that we need to go into when we seriously want to discuss these questions. Okay. In the following, I would like to try to capture this ethical challenge as precisely as possible against the background of the ongoing discussion on just peace. In the discussions on the concept of responsibility to protect, now for whom is this new? Hands up. Have you heard about the concept? Who has not heard about the concept is the question. The others are all fine? Great. You can go. The international community has made great headway. I base my argument mainly on the fact that the wider framework of just peace has enabled a shift of perspectives. Now, this is so important that when we discuss this, and I discuss that under not in the framework of just war, because when we discuss the doctrine of just war, the question is always posed as, when is war legitimate? That presupposes there is a legitimization of war. So when you only focus in your peace ethics on the question, how can we legitimize war, that would be a very limited peace ethics. Now this is why we have shifted the whole discussion into a just peace. That you say, like, let's talk about peace in our peace ethics, and not just about war, because a peace that is something that we are interested in, and we call it just peace because we have understood that peace doesn't come without justice. Otherwise, it is a very cheap peace. So justice has always been has to be involved, and there's a whole discussion then, of course, how that interrelates. I will not go into that. Go ahead.
I don't understand your last phrase exactly, because you said that we do not consider war when we are speaking about peace. Is that what you said?
We are not interested in our primary interest is not to say when is war legitimate.
But then, like, if we don't look at when the war is legitimate, then how can we identify it as a just war or not?
Mm-hmm.
And if the war was not just, then how we can even speak about the peace? Because there are, I believe, in my humble opinion, that there are two sides of the coin. So one cannot live with the other, without the other.
So you are suggesting that there is a justifiable war, right?
I think so.
So you can say that. Now, what happens if you say, well, let's phrase that as a question? Is it really true? Why are you saying that there is a justifiable war? On which ground are you saying that? Well, then you have to develop all that. But what happens if we make that the key question of peace ethics, that we constantly talk about war, 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 war? And wouldn't it be more productive and attractive to talk about how do we actually make peace? How do we, and that is not neglecting situations of violence. That is not neglecting the facts of terrorism and attacks and all the messiness that is going on. But the question that if I see Boko Haram in Nigeria acting, I mean, then if the only question is, can I wage war or not? Seems to be limiting the whole discourse always on the question, can we send military forces now or not? Whereas when we go around and say like, okay, we have a violent situation, how can that be solved? And that doesn't mean that we have to neglect all military and everything. That is not what I'm saying. But can we change perspectives? And I use this responsibility to protect concept as an example of how perspectives have been changed already, also in the discussions within the United Nations. There was another hand?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think the just war theory is not a starting point, but also a response, right? So how can we regulate a situation that's already occurring and keeps occurring? Like war is something that keeps coming up. So isn't it? I think
War is not just something that comes up. War is something that people decide to do.
yeah, okay, but it keeps on happening, and I totally agree that you should go to the root cause. So just peace sounds great, but I think you still need just war theories and like regulation more because it's for when it happens, right? Like I don't think the two are mutually exclusive.
That's right. And it is not, and it's good that you bring that up because it is where this terminology is a bit misleading. That it is not that this just peace concept is replacing the just war theory, so to speak, because just war theory only tries to answer the question, when is war legitimate? Now, just peace is a much broader term that can, for some people, that includes also, well, the military option is still on the table. We still have to consider that, and so you can, as you are proposing, you can include in the just peace thinking, you can include the just war theory and constantly test it and let it run in that framework. But if you let it run in that framework, then your primary goal and your primary focus in your thinking is not when can I legitimize war, but your primary thinking is how can I make peace in that situation. And that offers a totally new range of tools, probably, of alternatives, of methodologies that are not on the table when we just discuss just war. Yeah?
I do agree that you need this perspective, but what bothers me a bit is that like in academical language you can develop all like methodologies and everything, but then when it comes to actions you have all these peacekeeping missions, but do they really make peace and everything? Like it's part of the whole program, I know, but in the end they still have some kind of war elements in them, and by giving it another name, it's also like legitimizing it a little bit more because everybody wants peace. So it makes it, it's also a little bit sometimes a cover up.
Yeah.
When you look at civil wars and everything.
That is so true. That is true. Thank you for that comment. And yet we have to welcome to the university. We have to think it through in theory. But then of course I follow you and say like, but then we should, because this is a serious topic. This is about life and death. This is not just a nice academic game that we're playing. This is, if we want to contribute to a political discourse also as a university, then this means that we have to get our theories straight and consistent, number one, but we also have to test it over against the realities. And that means political powers, that means legal enforcement, that means human resources, that means all kinds of things. But I'm totally with you that it's not enough just to have nice theories. and then changing names and labels for the same kind of killing that was going on before. Then of course, then it's just a nice game that we can play and we can afford to play.
What about cyber peace?
I don't know. Let me go to this. Wrong question. So the shift of perspectives from the sovereignty of the government of a nation state towards protection of populations under direct threat. So what we said earlier, you know, and the sovereignty of a nation state. I mean, that's one of the highest, has been one of the highest. How do you say that? Values in the international law system, right? It's think United Nations. I mean, it's the sovereignty of the Netherlands that nobody shall touch and nobody can touch, and we would not be at that United Nations table if that would be questioned. Now, but that has led to very severe and difficult and violent situations and massive killings, because every government then can say, you know, I can kill my own people. This is an inner thing, you know. This is just Syria. What are all you people doing here, you know? And if Assad keeps on killing his own people, you know, it's the sovereignty of Syria. We cannot touch it. If you take Zimbabwe or take some other countries, so the international community has learned to say, well, there is a responsibility still, and that was with the genocide in Rwanda, of course, where the international community had been silent, had not intervened, had not acted, because everybody was hesitant, was like, yeah, but you know, if maybe we shouldn't, and then you cannot wage war, and what would happen, and so forth. So nothing really happened to stop the killings, and we saw that the massive killings. And after the genocide in Rwanda, then this discussion was really gearing up and say, like, but isn't there a responsibility of the international community? And there is a responsibility, of course. So that is a change of perspective. Shouldn't we think, when it comes to peace and war and violence, shouldn't we think from the perspective of the time is running? Mm-hmm. But I'm including the discussion already, okay. So I have more time.
You do. You're doing great.
I think it makes more sense that we allow questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Good. And we have until 5:30, right? Yeah.
At the latest, yeah.
Let's see. So, the second one, from the perspective of those who might potentially intervene to the integrity of people in need. Again, shifting of perspectives. You know, can we think of the ones who are really under threat? What is the best for them, and not when can we decide to wage war? From the power of decision held by the individual nation state to the international community acting in solidarity. Now here comes the reality check, right? At the moment, we wish that the United Nations would work like that. We wish that the Security Council would work like that. And what we see at the moment is a constant blocking of each other in different movements.
Yeah, to go back to the first one, protection, but in practice, how does it work? Does that mean in some situations go back to some kind of war?
Good question.
Again? And then you're back to the just war. Yeah,
that's a good question. So it was actually a Norwegian think tank who has started this thinking, and who has developed this concept of the responsibility to protect, and then it has been tested in many other circles and brought to the United Nations, and the United Nations have adopted this as a political concept. It is not clear what that means. This protection. So for some people read that as, okay, sometimes we have to protect, and then they immediately think, well, if I have to protect somebody, then of course I need tanks, I need weapons, I need military forces. For others, including myself, I say, yes, why don't we take it step by step, you know, protection, yes, but don't run too fast. I mean, all this does not imply immediately that you, again, fall back to the just war theory very quickly, because there we have our nice criteria and we follow that, and then we are in the same logic again. Why can't we just develop a concept that says, you know, protection is necessary, but then leave it open for the time being? I mean, then it has to be discussed, of course. At some point we have to come back to that. But for the time being, leave it open to decide what kind of means are appropriate.
But things change. So you can send a peacekeeping operation, and in the course of time, that can prove that it's not enough, that they cannot do anything.
Mm-hmm.
What then?
Yeah. That needs to, these are exactly the questions. Yes. Yeah.
But also, for example, if you are speaking about other means, for example, let's say sanctions, then like if you put a sanction on a country and then like after a while that country, the population will face poverty and like even like I don't know, let's say there is no milk for the children and like a lot of
Yeah.
babies are dying,
Yeah.
and that's also responsibility to protect it. Like okay, what shall we do?
Right.
Like there is lots of criteria in
Yeah.
this matter that you have to always foresee.
Yeah.
Even so, if you are not directly participating in a hostility.
Yeah. No, very, very true. And we had that situation, for example, in Iran with these long years and years and years of sanctions, and it was the civil society who was really knocking at all doors and saying, "Guys, stop it! You know, you are killing us, and we are the targets in the end." And that's the problem with sanctions. That it usually it hits the poor people first, and it takes a long time until it hits the rich ones, and those are the ones in power. Now, on the other hand, we have examples like South Africa. When we had the apartheid system, it was clear that without the sanctions against South Africa, the economic sanctions from the West, that apartheid system, we might still see that today. So it was the Mandelas and people like that who then later on said, "Guys, without your sanctions, we would have not made it. It would have been, or it would have ended in civil war." So you have it's always you have examples for everything. So these are the difficult political decisions to be made.
What's actually the core thing that every situation can't be applied in one theory because it's so specific. Because we have
Yes.
heard all examples here.
Yes. Yes.
And still we try to find something like some overall conclusion. And I know, it just bothers me a lot and like also in class. Like, you can't apply it in everything. Like,
Yeah. Now, what do you do with that?
well, I think it's really good to like, well, maybe develop like a theory or a plan for every situation in particular. Because now we spend so many times to like to adjust the like already existing theory on all those little things. And war changes, like we have new wars now. And yeah, well, we have to adjust and we have to constantly adjust to the dynamic system, right?
Right. And yet it is. But are you proposing then that we should forget theory and just look into every situation as itself?
Try to like make the theory a little bit more flexible, like not to say, well, this is it, and we have to work with this. And we
It is.
try to,
It is
like,
flexible. I will show you how flexible it is in a minute. It is really flexible. So the other perspectives from the power of decision held by the individual nation states, we've seen that, from a focus on military action to a broad range of peace-building efforts. So the responsibility to protect, just to name the three dimensions that are included here. It's the responsibility to prevent. So it is really the prevention of a conflict. So the responsibility of the international community does not start only when the conflict is hot, when the killing is already going on. There is a responsibility of the international community to prevent conflicts. Now you can think for yourself how much investment goes into that. Then the responsibility to react or to intervene. So when the conflict is hot, then there is a responsibility for the international community to intervene. That doesn't tell us anything about the means yet. That doesn't say anything about the legitimization of weapons or military actions. Intervention can also be non-violent intervention. Intervention can have many forms. Again, some people might read this like, okay, so this is responsibility to react. Okay, then here you have the just war theory again. It's very clear, there's a responsibility. We have to do it. We don't like it, but we have to do it. Well, why? Can't there be other means of reaction? And the responsibility to rebuild. There's also, so if you decide in a conflict to become part of that conflict, or you think that you have a responsibility to do something with it, that includes the responsibility to rebuild after. Afghanistan is a brilliant example. All these Western countries running into Afghanistan. It's a disaster since so many years. I think how many? 15 years now, or what? 16? And there's still no plan what to do with it. It was, I mean, there's no, and there's no rebuilding. It's at least, again, for the German troops, I can say that. They're basically now, the argument is that we have to send more troops from Germany because they have to take care of the security of the German troops. So you wonder, you know, what, is that really meeting the responsibility that we are talking about here in theory world? Of course it is not. Now, coming back to you, what was the question? The theory. This is how flexible this theory is. When it came to Libya, you know, Gaddafi, we have to stop it. There is, Gaddafi is a dictator. He's killing his own people. It's a disaster. There is a responsibility to protect the civilian people in Libya. So we have to intervene. We have to send military troops. NATO decided. It was decided by the UN Security Council. And the reasoning behind it was, everybody was talking about that, it is based on this theory, responsibility to protect. Now that was the moment for a lot of us to wake up and say, like, really, is this what you meant when you decided that this is what it is? Well, these images speak for themselves, I guess. So it's as beautiful as this responsibility to protect concept is, and it is really, I think it helps a lot, because as I have shown before, it helps to really make a shift in the perspectives. And I think that is what is so valuable about that theory and that concept. Again, the application in politics is then yet another question, as we see. And it's the same like with the just war theory. It's almost sometimes it feels like it's the same misuse of theory as was with a just war theory. That we had that theory in order to prevent war. In fact, it has served all the time to wage war. And now it almost becomes the same fate with the responsibility to protect. That actually it was invented in order to prevent military intervention, in order to become more creative when it comes to conflict. Now it leads to what we saw in Libya. So but that is not. Then you cannot blame the theory for it. What you have to do is you have to blame the politicians for this who are making these decisions. I don't know how did the Netherlands vote on that one. Germany was neutral. I remember that. Okay, let's not, sorry about that. wrong question from my side. Okay, so the ethical challenge, I want to rephrase then the ethical challenge that I find interesting and legitimate. That what are we talking about then in terms of, you know, the legitimization of violence? Can an ethic legitimize the use of force? And now I'm using force here. Somebody else has used force earlier. I think you did. Force, once all non-violent means have been explored, that is limited, so a force that is limited solely to defense against violence and the reduction of violence, and solely for the purpose of protecting those who are directly threatened in life and limb, and who are calling for such protection. So for me, this is I have developed this as the key question. So within the whole framework of just peace, where we say, well, let's become more creative. Let's use all our brains and capacities to develop non-violent conflict resolution things, even self-defense. You know, what kind of things can be done? And there's a lot of conflict transformation going on that the media don't cover because it's not spectacular. Nobody's killed, so it's not so interesting. We only look at things when the blood is there, then we think like, oh, something's going on. So much is going on. But what kind of force, and maybe there is sometimes, not maybe, I believe that sometimes force is even, or might be legitimized, some kind of force when it comes to situations of self-defense, when it comes to situations of defending people who are under immediate threat, for example. But how can we legitimize that? I mean, if we have so many problems with the just war theory, Is there, we still, within the framework of the just peace, we still have to answer that question, how to deal with that. And this is something to wrestle with. Just policing is one concept that is not too well known, but it has been developed. I have lost my track here totally. I'm just speaking out of my head now. Well, maybe that's good. It's more fun anyway to discuss it with you. I just wanted to show you that I'm a good German professor. I have a text and I can read that to you. So I hope you are impressed already. Just policing is a concept that has been developed by scholars, interestingly enough, with Christian background, and on the one side Roman Catholic scholars who are totally in this tradition of just war theory, who have always defended that, who said, no, you know, yeah, we live in an unredeemed world. We have to deal with it, and yeah, nobody likes killing, but sometimes, you know, last resort, all the criteria. Sometimes it's just our duty. And you have historic peace churches in the same Christian faith pocket who have always been saying, no, as a Christian you cannot kill. As a Christian you do not go to military forces, you do not join them. And these traditions, as I have always said, with that kind of faith, you cannot become part of that. Well, both positions have their problems, as you know, and as you probably see. They have been in dialogue on this issue, and they came up with this idea of just policing, because it was the Catholics who said, well, in the end, you know, what we really think is it is really about just these few situations where it is about immediate protection. When people are under threat, and you can, of course, you can decide for yourself, I'm allowing the other person to kill me because I will not kill somebody else. You can decide for yourself to become a martyr. But you cannot, on a Christian ethics standpoint, you cannot decide that you should be a martyr or you should be a martyr. So when I see somebody attacking you and killing you, what is my responsibility there? It is not possible to say, well, you should be a martyr. I mean, that would be glorifying killing in itself then. So that goes totally wrong. So there is the response. If you decide for yourself that you don't want to defend yourself with violence, there's still the remaining question is always, how do you defend the other, your neighbor? And as the Christian faith even tells you, you should also love your enemy. I mean, that's something to wrestle with. So these traditions, having a dialogue, and they said, those who are in favor of just war, they said, well, in the end, it's about protection of the other. That is the key aspect. And for the ones who are in the non-violent tradition, have also said, you know, we decide for ourselves not to become violent, but we have problems in when it comes to situations when it becomes about protection. So shouldn't there some kind of force be legitimized? And then they were thinking along these lines and came up with this idea of policing. I mean, isn't policing do away with the military logic? Because military logic always buys into weapons of mass destruction, into bombing, into, you know, massive killings. What about policing? Isn't that a kind of force, now differentiating that from violence, that should be legitimate and should be legitimized, and then you should still debate, you know, what kind of policing that should be?
Is that not just neo-colonialism?
Why would that be?
Well, for example, I would be France, and I would say there are conflicts in Western Africa, and I send my foreign legion there to create peace. And now I have a force in Western Africa very close to the government.
Yes. If you do it like that, then you are absolutely right. That would be neo-colonialism. This is why it's called just peace. So justice is involved. You cannot see that. But one of the conditions would be that those people under threat would also agree to that. And the authority that would decide on it would be the international community. So you cannot just, as a Dutch person, you cannot just say, okay, we have this brilliant idea. There are some people sitting there in a valley and we have to protect them now. Let's send our police there. This is not at all the idea, because that would be neo-colonialism.
About the international community, do you include minor groups that are not recognized as a state, or how do you define the international community
What do you have in mind? Whom do you have in mind?
Well, I just, if you look at R2P and the United Nations, they only cover nation states. But then nowadays you have like a lot of sub-countries evolving and they call combat groups or religious groups or professional groups, however you will call them. And if you, where you write about your what you're talking about now, how do you explain that?
I mean, we use international community when we speak about all of us, and I know that in UN language that is usually reduced to governments, official governments. We use it when I'm involved with the World Council of Churches. When we use that there, then we mean, of course, much more than just the governments. It is most of all the civil societies that we find all over the place.
Civil society should also have a right to protect in that.
Absolutely. So that is the idea, that not only governments should decide on just policing, for example. It should be exactly the ones who are really involved, who are a player anyway. And that's the problem. I mean that usually the ones who are affected are not asked at all. This is decided somewhere if it's good at the United Nations in New York. If it's going wrong, then it's decided in Washington. So this idea is about to have international policing forces that would be controlled by international law of the international community. It would be bound to human rights very clearly. So you cannot just go out there and apply some violence that would not be playing according to the human rights. Only to protecting the most vulnerable from direct violence, not allowed to intervene as a party or as an aggressor or to be perceived as such. That is also the idea. So you do not enter into a conflict and you take sides. You enter into the conflict as a protecting force. Only aim at the de-escalation and minimizing of violence. So that's the major goal. Exercise as little coercion as possible. Not seek to gain victory over others. Very important. Most of the times it's about victory. It's about winning a conflict. Now the police is not about winning. Police is about reducing violence, de-escalation. Think of police forces at its best. Don't think about misuse of police or military police forces. And strive to enable a win-win solution. So it's more this mediating idea that we have here with the just policing. That of course would require a totally different training. I mean, if you compare it to military training and what soldiers are learning when they have their education, such a just policing would have training in nonviolent conflict resolution, in trust building measures, in cultural sensitivity. Now, I can give you the most crazy examples, of course, where soldiers of the Western Allies have been entering territories without any knowledge about the culture whatsoever. Now, that is impossible. That is how in the world will you ever find some trust? I will come to you. Self-defense without needing to kill, support and cooperation with civil society. There you go. This sort of intervention should pursue no other political aim than that of protecting human beings and offering them a chance of law and justice, to be defined together with those concerned. So it's always the civil society that we talk about, that is influenced, that is in the midst of the conflict. That should also be the actor who is sitting at the table making the decisions.
Actually, what the culture part of my thing, not only the culture part really bothers me. Also, like one of the cases was for Bosnia, if I'm not wrong, about the peacekeepers who actually became very big problem that they were profited for human trafficking and sex slavery, things like that, which actually the Blue Helmet troops became the problem even in the region itself.
Right, and I mean, some people when they hear this, just policing for the first time, say we have peacekeeping forces. This is Blue Helmets. That's the whole idea. Well, the problem that we see there is exactly what you are pointing to. That who are these people who have these blue helmets? They are not. These are regular soldiers.
I was
And now think about the seriousness of the problem, you know, of a conflict where you have 2 or 3 or more parties involved. How difficult that is in itself. And now you put people into that. What kind of training do you wish them to have in order to be able to reduce violence? Well, first of all, they have to be able to communicate. They have to be able to relate somehow. They need to understand what this whole conflict is about. Now, don't send some soldiers in there who have been trained to kill and to rob through the ground. That is naive.
But military training doesn't precisely exclude all of that, right? Or does it?
Does it?
I don't think it's necessary.
Not necessarily, but do you have a good example?
No, not in practice, but it might also happen with the training of your just policing force.
It would be wonderful. I mean, I would be all in favor, and that would be a great move. I think if in military training, all of this would be included. We have some little pockets here and there where that is tried, and that's. I mean, this is not about military bashing. This is about understanding. You know, what kind of logics, what kind of ideas are floating around here, because we don't want to be fooled by political decisions that just throw out some argumentations and where we end up, and this is basically my message, where we end up saying like, oh yeah, sometimes you cannot just sit there and do nothing. Well, let's be more creative than that.
I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
when Dutch Bat 3 was sent to Srebrenica, they were sent without weapons. And what happened there is that 1,000 Bosniak men and boys were slaughtered. And they came back and they were, well, they still haven't been fully prosecuted, at least. But that was, I think, an example of how to police, or some just policing, that went completely wrong.
Why was that just policing?
Because of the absence of violence, or the absence of force. That's one of the reasons.
What were the Dutch soldiers doing?
They were policing.
No, they were not doing anything.
But at least we did something, right? We sent something.
What did you do?
Well, the Dutch government sent something.
Yes, they sent soldiers.
So, I mean, you began your talk with, we cannot just sit here and do nothing.
Right.
So we did something.
Yes.
But in the end, it was actually nothing. But still, politically, we could say we did something. Also to make up.
Yeah, but it has led to a Dutch trauma. I believe, you know, coming from another country, I believe that this still is a trauma of this society here. You can correct me in that, but I still believe that is, whenever we talk about these issues, that comes up as an example of what did we do, and what I mean, I've studied it a bit only, that some of these people involved, I mean, I really feel for them, but some of them are suffering from that experience. We did not intervene. We had the ability, we had the weapons, we could have stopped the killing, and we didn't. We are...
Sorry, my point is that the international community, through the UN, sent, because the Netherlands say, yeah, we're going to do that because we still have something to make up for what we did in Indonesia.
Right.
So, we did something.
Yeah.
According to the international community, according to what comes close to your theory of just policing and just peace. But the point is that this case shows that actually, in fact, it's just another way of wording, as she said over there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what then is it that we do not need to do? That
Yeah, good question. Good question, I get you.
Moreover, in this line, to what extent is police, or just policing, different from the peaceful task that our military forces are doing, for instance, in Mali? I mean, is there a principal difference or just
the principal
simple practical
yes.
difference that one is a military and the other is a policeman?
The difference is really these two slides. So what I said, and especially the training. I have problems with the training and the mandate of these troops. What are they actually doing, and how are they trained? Are they really skilled for the task that they are sent out? Sitting down with military people, with high generals, usually in these discussions, that they say what the politicians are asking us to do, we are not trained to do. They expect us to do things in Mali that we are not trained to do. So it's most of the time it's the military people who are the most critical ones who say like, have you thought this through? And where is this leading us to? Well, we have to do something. So my point is that if we really are serious about, it's all about protection of people, it's all about our ethical, moral standards, why don't we then invest also exactly in that and develop some kind of tools and some kind of mechanisms and some kind of training that allow those poor people that we send there on our behalf, that they are really equipped to do what we are asking them to do. That is the thing that I'm wrestling with.
Well, maybe it's not ideal, but the intention is anyway to train them
Yes.
in these principles.
Yes, the intention. That's the labeling. Yes. Okay, I don't want to be too rude, and there is serious intention. I see that, and especially those in the military forces who are responsible for their boys. These are usually the ones who put up all the stop signs and say, guys, think about this again. I don't find like, especially I'm more than again Germany is my experience that in the Bundeswehr I find excellent leading personnel that are usually the ones who are the most careful people to say like, this is not making sense. We do not have the capacity.
That's then a different matter, not to have the capacity, because maybe they're reluctant because they know this will last for years and years. I mean, the interventions in Afghanistan, how old is it?
Yeah.
In Mali, and they know that this policing, because this is what's happening, they know that they will never get out of it.
No.
And when they go out of the country, then it starts again. They look at Congo and
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah, so some of these people who are involved in non-violent peacemaking, they have this knowledge. They say, well, you have to commit yourself for a long time period. If you are not willing to spend a lot of time in that context, wherever you go, don't even start. You will not make peace there. You will not protect anybody. In the long run, it will not work. So it is.
Because we're not talking about missions in 6 months or 1 year.
No, forget it. If somebody announces to you a military action in 6 months, it will all be over, or in a year we will solve it. Forget it. It's lying. It's just. But the problem is that our societies work like that. If they had told us in Germany that we will be in Afghanistan for 16 or more years, everybody would have said, "Don't even start. 16 years? I mean, you must be kidding." But they were telling us, it's a year, maybe 2. But it's. So it's. But we are the ones who allow us to be fooled. It's on us to make decisions. It's democracies.
And can I just, in Congo, the big issue was that people did not have this qualified share of on training. But would you recommend local police? Because when you send people there for 16 years, you can get them away from the country and the hell can break out again, or well, the hell is still continuing to break out. Because what would you recommend?
Yeah, it is. So this is. There has been research has been done now. How can that be? How can that become practical? So far, it is basically it is ideas, it's theories, it's concepts. But thinking along these lines that I've taken you through. It is now. You can think in different ways. You can say if that police force in the local police force, if that is not a corrupted force, number one. Secondly, is that an entity, a social entity that is still accepted by the different parties? If that is not accepted, forget it. They will not work. Then it's just one-sided from the beginning. It's useless. It will not work. So it's.
In Afghanistan, the Dutch went there to train police, and then you train someone with Dutch knowledge, so it doesn't really work.
This is what I said in the beginning. That is another way of it's the question mark. Is that really helping? We hope that the Germans do the same, because you cannot sell it to the German society anymore that we need troops in Afghanistan. Everybody's saying why? No, now we are stabilizing the situation by training the police forces. Now what we see is happening, not all over the place, but in a lot of cases, these police forces then they drop out and do the next bombing. Because they have all the knowledge from us now. Wonderful. What? So that route is also not too promising, I must say. There must be this searching for the third way, as we call it. You know, can we think in more alternatives than just, oh, we cannot sit there and do nothing, and here we have our military tools. If your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
But for a third way, it also makes me think about the need to take in refugees. I mean, if you're looking for a non-violent solution to these conflicts, the obvious solution to me is, well, give people who are trying to flee a place to flee to. That's a great way to do something without killing
For
them.
example, time's up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernando, for a great talk. And thank you all for your comments and your questions. As mentioned before, the issues we discussed here will be dealt with in detail during the minor, starting in September.
You can all become students.
Yeah, you're welcome to attend. And we hope to see you all back on for our fourth and last lecture in the series. That's on June 7. One final question.
Yeah, we have to sign a list.
The list is in the bag.